Picture this: a flat, sun-scorched plain in what is now western Ukraine, the summer of 1694. The air smells of dry grass, horse sweat, and something else. Something metallic and sharp, the way the air smells right before violence tears the world apart. The sky is pale and huge overhead, the kind of merciless summer sky that offers no shade, no shelter, no mercy. Now put yourself there. You are standing in that field. You have a saber at your hip. Your horse is trembling beneath you, not from exhaustion, but from something it can sense before you can see it. A vibration in the earth, a low, rhythmic thunder that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. You look to the east, and then you see it. Dust. A wall of dust stretching from horizon to horizon. And inside that cloud of dust, riders. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Crimean Tatar horsemen pouring across the steppe like a black river breaking its banks. Their war cries echo across the plain, high-pitched and relentless, the sound of an army that has never once doubted its ability to destroy whatever stands in its path. You count your companions. 400. 400 men on horseback, armed with sabers, lances, pistols, and sheer, absolute, defiant refusal to run. The enemy numbers 40,000. Let that sink in. 100 to 1. 100 enemy soldiers for every single man standing beside you. By every rational calculation, by every law of war, by every instinct that evolution has spent millions of years drilling into the human nervous system, you should run. You should scatter. You should disappear into the steppe and pray that the Tatars don't bother to chase you. But you don't run. Neither did they. What you are about to hear is not a myth. It is not a legend, polished smooth by centuries of national pride. It is a documented, verified, historically recorded event that happened on the 29th of September, 1694, near a small village called Hodów in the Podolia region of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. 400 Polish cavalry, among them roughly 100 of the most elite warriors in the world, held off a Crimean Tatar horde, 40,000 strong, for 6 brutal hours. And when the Tatars finally sent a translator under a flag of truce to offer the Poles safe passage, to beg them to just stop fighting and leave with their lives, the Polish commander laughed and refused. The Tatars rode away in disbelief. 400 men had psychologically broken 40,000. Albrecht, that is what we are here to talk about today. If you're new here, welcome. Seriously, welcome. This channel is dedicated to telling the stories that most history classes skip over. The battles that changed civilizations. The moments where a small group of extraordinary human beings looked at impossible odds and decided the odds were wrong. If that sounds like your kind of content, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to this channel. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from right now. I genuinely love reading those. And if this story hits you the way I think it will, smash that like button when we're done. It helps more people find this content, and stories like this deserve to be heard. Now, let's go back. Let's go all the way back to understand why this battle happened, what it meant, and why 400 men refused to die. Before we get to the blood and the dust and the impossible stand at Hodów, we need to talk about what was actually at stake. Because this was not just a battle between Polish cavalry and Tatar horsemen. This was not simply a local skirmish on the Ukrainian steppe, the kind of minor engagement that gets a single paragraph in a university textbook and is promptly forgotten. No. What happened at Hodów was a battle for the survival of an entire civilization's eastern frontier. And if you understand the context, really understand it, the courage of those 400 men becomes even more staggering. The year is 1694. Think about where Europe is at this moment. So the great continent is exhausted and bleeding from decades of war. The 30 Years' War has carved Germany into a wasteland. France, under Louis XIV, is throwing its armies across the Rhine in every direction, desperate to dominate the continent. England is wrestling with its own political convulsions, and out on the eastern edge of Christendom, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the largest state in Europe by landmass, is fighting for its life. For 60 years, Poland has been squeezed from every direction. The Cossack uprising of the 1640s, the catastrophic Swedish invasion of the 1650s, a war so devastating that Polish chroniclers called it simply the Deluge, a flood of fire and sword that killed 1/3 of Poland's population. Then the Russian wars, then the Ottoman campaigns. And running through all of it, like a razor wire along the entire eastern and southern frontier, the Crimean Tatars. The Tatars. We need to talk about the Tatars, because if you're going to understand the miracle of Hodów, you need to understand exactly what 40,000 Tatar horsemen represented. Not as statistics, as a living, breathing, absolutely terrifying force of war. Think about that. For 3 centuries, 300 years, the Crimean Khanate had been raiding the eastern frontiers of Poland, Russia, and the steppe nations with near total impunity. Their raids were not just military operations. They were economic enterprises of staggering scale. Historians estimate that between 1500 and 1700, Crimean Tatar raiders carried off somewhere between 2 and 3 million people from Poland, Russia, and Ukraine into slavery. 2 to 3 million human beings, torn from their homes, marched south to the Crimean Peninsula, sold in the slave markets of Kaffa to buyers from Istanbul, Egypt, Persia, and across the Islamic world. The Tatars weren't just warriors. They were the most sophisticated cavalry-based raiding machine in the world. And in the summer of 1694, they were coming west again. Step back. Let's go back further and understand how we got here. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the late 17th century was a paradox wrapped in a coat of mail. On paper, it was one of the most sophisticated political organisms in the world. It had an elected monarch. Yes, the king was chosen by the nobility, not born into the role. It had a parliament, the Sejm, where free debate was supposedly guaranteed. It had religious tolerance that would have seemed radical in Western Europe, where Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and Jews lived side by side under common law. But paradoxes have a way of being fatal in a dangerous world. The same political system that made Poland philosophically enlightened made it militarily crippled. The liberum veto, the rule that any single nobleman in the Sejm could dissolve the parliament and void all legislation by shouting, "I do not allow it," meant that passing anything, raising taxes, funding armies, passing military reforms, required unanimous consensus. In practice, it meant that the Commonwealth's enemies had learned to simply bribe 1 or 2 ambitious noblemen to veto every military spending bill. Poland's armies were perpetually underfunded, perpetually under strength, perpetually showing up to every crisis smaller and poorer than the threat demanded. So this was the political reality of the 1690s. John III Sobieski, the great king who had led the famous cavalry charge at Vienna in 1683 and driven the Ottomans back from the gates of Western civilization. That man was now in his 60s, his health failing, his political authority hollowed out by years of factional warfare, with the very noblemen he'd spent his life defending. The king who had saved Europe 11 years before could barely pass a budget through his own parliament. And the Tatars knew it. The Crimean Khanate, under Khan Sadet II Giray, was not stupid. These people had been navigating the politics of Eastern Europe for 3 centuries. They had spies. They had informants. They knew that Poland's military was stretched impossibly thin. They knew that the Holy League's great war against the Ottomans was still grinding on, absorbing resources that might otherwise have defended the eastern frontier. They knew that the Polish garrison forces in Podolia were skeleton crews, operating on reduced pay, sometimes weeks behind on supplies, holding a frontier that stretched for hundreds of miles, with forces that barely numbered in the thousands. And so, in the late summer of 1694, Khan Sadet II Giray assembled one of the largest raiding forces the Crimean Khanate had sent into Polish territory in a generation. 40,000 horsemen, warriors who had been riding and fighting since childhood. Men who could sleep in the saddle, navigate by stars, live for weeks on dried meat and mare's milk, and cover 60 miles in a day across open steppe. Their objective was simple: raid deep into Podolia, burn the villages, take the livestock, and most importantly, take the people. As many as they could bind, chain, and march back to Crimea before the Polish army could react. Nobody expected a fight. Not a real one. The border garrisons were too small, too poor, too scattered to offer meaningful resistance. The plan was to sweep through like a storm, take everything valuable, and be back across the steppe before Poland could organize a response. They were about to be very, very wrong. 40,000 Tatar horsemen. I want you to really sit with that number. Because 40,000 cavalry is not just a large army. It is a force that reshapes the geography of war. It is a force that makes roads irrelevant, because they don't need roads. They navigate by landmarks and stars. It makes supply lines irrelevant, because they carry what they need and take what they want from the land around them. It makes fortifications partially irrelevant, because they simply bypass anything that can't be quickly taken by storm, burning the countryside around it and starving it into submission. The Crimean Tatar way of war was one of the most refined and lethal military systems ever developed for the kind of warfare that dominated the Eurasian steppe. Let me break it down for you, because understanding their tactics is essential to understanding what made Hodów so extraordinary. First, mobility. Tatar armies moved fast, fantastically, terrifyingly fast. Every Tatar warrior rode with multiple horses, typically 2 or 3, sometimes more, switching mounts throughout the march to keep the animals fresh. This meant that a Tatar raiding force could cover ground that would take a conventional European army a week to march in 2 or 3 days. They didn't march in columns on roads. They spread across the steppe in a wide front, dozens of miles across, sweeping through the landscape like a net. Second, archery. The Tatars were horse archers in the tradition stretching back through the Mongols, the Scythians, the ancient steppe warriors who had terrorized, settled civilizations for thousands of years. They could shoot composite bows from horseback at a full gallop with devastating accuracy, launching several arrows per minute in rapid succession. They could shoot forward, to the sides, and famously backwards, the Parthian shot, releasing arrows as they appeared to retreat, luring pursuers into ambushes. Their bows had a draw weight and range that put European crossbows to shame. Third, hit and run. The Tatars almost never fought the way European armies fought. No holding ground, no pitched infantry battles, no lines and columns and formal engagements. They struck like lightning, fast, hard, from unexpected directions. And when the enemy reacted, they melted away across the steppe before the counterattack could land. Then they circled back, struck again from a different direction, and repeated the process until the enemy was exhausted, disorganized, and could be finished off in detail. And fourth, sheer, overwhelming numbers. 40,000 warriors is not just a raiding force, it is an invasion. It is a tide. Even if you could form up a disciplined defensive line and hold off one charge, there were 39,000 more men behind it. Even if you broke one flank, the other would envelop you. Even if you killed 100 men in a single exchange, they had hundreds more charges left to give. This was the force that descended on Podolia in September of 1694. And they had done it before, and they had gotten away with it every time, for 300 years. The history of Tatar raids against Poland reads like a catalogue of human misery. 1618. Raid into Podolia, thousands enslaved. 1626. Massive raid reaching deep into Polish heartland. 1648. The Tatars allied with Khmelnytsky's Cossacks and helped destroy 2 Polish armies in a single year. 1672. They helped the Ottomans conquer Kamianets-Podilsky, the great fortress city that was supposed to be Poland's impenetrable eastern stronghold. It fell in a week. They were not a force that European armies simply stopped. They were a force that European armies survived if they were very lucky, or didn't survive at all. Think about that. This is what 400 Polish cavalrymen were about to confront. Imagine standing there, the dust cloud on the horizon, the thunder of 40,000 horses. Any rational mind looks at those numbers and sees only one outcome. But rational minds had never quite accounted for what it meant to be a Polish Hussars in the year of our Lord, 1694. Who were these 400 men? That question deserves a real answer, because they were not simply soldiers. They were not conscripts dragged from farms and given horses. They were not desperate men with nowhere to run. They were the product of one of the most demanding, most expensive, most psychologically intense warrior traditions in the history of Europe. And to understand them, you have to understand what Poland had survived in the previous 50 years. The deluge. Let's talk about the deluge. When Swedish armies poured into Poland in 1655, they did not come as conquerors seeking to rule. They came as destroyers. Sweden under Charles X, Gustav, burned, looted, and depopulated an enormous swath of Central Europe's most populous and prosperous state. Cities that had taken centuries to build were torched in days. The population of Poland fell from roughly 11 million to somewhere around 7 or 8 million in a decade of war. Whole regions of the country became uninhabited wastelands, where wolves walked through the ruins of abandoned villages. If that level of trauma doesn't sound immediately familiar, imagine losing a third of everyone you know. Your neighbors, your family, your community. Imagine the psychological reality of an entire nation that has watched its civilization be partially dismantled within living memory. And then imagine the kind of warrior culture that emerges from that experience. Polish cavalry in the late 17th century was not the cavalry of a prosperous, stable nation secure in its own power. It was the cavalry of a nation that had learned, through the most brutal possible experience, that survival required extraordinary human excellence, because the mediocre had died. The average had been swept away by the deluge, by the Cossack wars, by decades of conflict on every frontier simultaneously. What remained was the absolute best that Polish military culture could produce. The Winged Hussars, the Hussaria, were the apex of this tradition. Only the sons of the wealthiest Polish nobility could afford to become one. The horse alone, a massive, specially bred animal capable of carrying 300 pounds of man and armor at 30 miles per hour, cost more than a peasant family could earn in years. The armor, the lance, the distinctive arched wings rising behind the rider's saddle, all of it represented a personal investment that would beggar most families. But beyond the equipment was something that couldn't be bought: the training. Years of horsemanship that began in childhood. Not just riding, but charging at full gallop through obstacles. Controlling a half-ton of terrified warhorse with knee pressure alone, while managing a 17-foot lance with one hand. Learning to maintain formation discipline at speed, the critical art of transitioning from loose ranks to the crushing knee-to-knee formation that made the hussar charge so devastatingly effective. They practiced against each other, against targets, against live animals. They trained in heat and cold, at dawn and in the dark. And crucially, they had been fighting the Tatars their entire lives. Many of them had fathers, brothers, uncles who had died in Tatar raids or Tatar-allied campaigns. The Tatar threat was not an abstract military problem to these men. It was the background radiation of their entire existence, the persistent, generational danger that had shaped everything about Polish military culture for 3 centuries. They knew the Tatar way of war. They knew how it worked. They knew its strengths, and crucially, they knew its weaknesses. Like the unit that found itself facing 40,000 Tatar horsemen at Hodów on that September morning in 1694, was led by Stefan Stanisław Czarniecki, a name that carries weight in Polish military history. The nephew of the famous Stefan Czarniecki, who had led Polish resistance during the darkest years of the Swedish deluge. Military tradition ran in this family like blood, and under his command were approximately 300 hussars and 100 of the lighter pancerni cavalry, men who lacked the full armor and wings of the hussars, but were no less deadly at close quarters, and who often served as the flexible, mobile force that could plug gaps in a defensive line. 400 men total, against 40,000. The mathematics were grotesque, but mathematics aren't everything. Let that sink in. How do you end up at those odds? The answer lies in the nature of the Tatar raid itself, and in one specific moment of decision that transformed a routine border patrol into one of the most legendary defensive actions in European history. The Tatar force had crossed into Podolia without the advance warning that would normally give Polish border forces time to concentrate. Their speed, that terrifying, legendary Tatar speed, had compressed the reaction time that the Commonwealth's scattered garrisons needed to organize. By the time local commanders understood the scale of what was happening, the Tatars were already deep inside Polish territory. Czarniecki's force, those 400 cavalrymen, encountered the main Tatar column near Hodów. And here is where the story hinges on a single extraordinary decision. He could have retreated. Every military textbook ever written would have told him to retreat. You do not engage 40,000 enemy cavalry with 400 men. You do not stand and fight when you are outnumbered 100 to 1. You fall back. You send riders screaming for reinforcements. You survive to fight another day. But retreat meant something else. It meant those 40,000 Tatars rode unopposed into the interior of Podolia. It meant villages burned. It meant thousands of civilians, men, women, children, bound with rope and marched south toward the slave markets of Kaffa. It meant that the families of the soldiers who ran would be the ones enslaved. This was the psychological turning point. Not a dramatic speech, not a stirring proclamation. Just the cold, a brutal calculus of a man who understood exactly what was at stake and decided that mathematics could go to hell. Czarniecki ordered his men to form up. Imagine the moment that order was given. Imagine being one of those 400. You've already seen the enemy. You've seen the dust cloud. You've heard the war cries. You've felt that primal, stomach-dropping terror that evolution installed in human beings, specifically to prevent suicidal stands like this one. And your commander looks at you and says, "We fight." What would you have done? What is remarkable What elevates this story from mere military history to something that approaches the territory of the mythological is that not a single man broke and ran. Not one. 400 men looked at 40,000 enemies and tightened their formation. There's an old Polish concept, perhaps untranslatable into English without losing something essential, of nie zginiemy, we shall not perish. Not a boast, not bravado, something deeper than that. A quiet, absolute refusal to accept the verdict that the universe appears to have already handed down. We shall not perish. Not today. They formed their circle, and they waited. Now let's talk tactics, because what happened at Hodów was not random heroism. It was not blind courage stumbling its way through a lucky afternoon. It was a masterpiece of small unit defensive warfare executed with extraordinary skill and discipline. And if you understand what they actually did, the victory becomes even more remarkable. The terrain around Hodów mattered. The Podolia region is not flat, featureless steppe everywhere. It's cut through by ravines, gullies, and small river valleys that break up the landscape. Czarniecki chose his ground carefully. He positioned his 400 men in a formation that military historians who have studied this engagement call a Tabor defense, adapted from the wagon fort tactics that various Eastern European armies had used for generations against steppe cavalry. Without wagons, without the heavy infantry that would normally anchor such a defense, the 400 cavalrymen did something that required extraordinary horse discipline. They formed a tight circular formation, horses facing outward, creating a living fortress. Think of it as a medieval hedgehog, an all-around defensive perimeter with no exposed flanks, no open rear, no vulnerable angle that the Tatars could exploit to get behind the formation and collapse it. This matters more than it might seem at first glance. The entire tactical genius of Tatar warfare was built around exploiting flanks and rears. Hit one end of an enemy line, force them to turn to meet the threat, then hit the other end while they're turning. Draw out a pursuit, let the enemy cavalry chase you, then swing back and hit them from the sides when they're strung out and disorganized. The Tatars had been doing this for centuries. It worked against every conventional army because conventional armies had flanks that could be turned. A circle has no flanks. A circle has no rear. A circle is the purest geometrical rebuttal to the Tatar way of war. But a circle has its own vulnerabilities. Most critically, pressure. If the enemy can sustain enough concentrated pressure on any single point of the circle long enough, the defenders will eventually be overwhelmed by sheer volume of casualties. In a conventional battle, a defensive circle, sometimes called a wagon logger in different cultural contexts, is a survival tactic, not a victory tactic. You use it to hold on until someone rescues you, or until the attacker runs out of momentum. But Czarniecki didn't just plan to hold on passively. This is the tactical insight that separates the Battle of Hodów from a simple, desperate defense. The Hussaria and pancerni cavalry were not just sitting inside a circle, waiting to be killed slowly. They were fighting back with everything they had: pistols, carbines, and, most terrifyingly, saber charges out from the circle itself. When the Tatar formations came close enough, when a wave of attackers pushed in too near the perimeter, the Polish cavalry would explode outward from one section of the circle in a coordinated countercharge, sabers screaming, driving the Tatars back far enough to reduce the pressure, then wheel and return to the formation before the larger Tatar force could encircle them. Think about what this required. You're in a defensive circle. Enemy horsemen are pressing in from every direction. The noise is overwhelming. Thousands of horses, war cries in a language you understand perfectly, the crack of firearms, the clash of steel on steel. Men near you are being wounded. Horses are screaming. And in that chaos, You have to wait for the exact right moment. Not too soon, not too late. And then launch a controlled countercharge, knowing that you have to hit hard enough to drive the enemy back, but not pursue so far that you lose the protection of the formation. The discipline required to do that, to fight with controlled aggression rather than the blind berserker fury that battlefield adrenaline tries to push every soldier toward, is almost incomprehensible. These men had it. They had it because they had been training for exactly this since childhood. The guns mattered too. In 1694, firearms technology had reached a point where the flintlock pistol and cavalry carbine were genuinely useful weapons, not decisive at range, but lethal at the distances where cavalry fights happen. A man on horseback with 2 loaded pistols and a carbine gets 3 shots before cold steel becomes his only option. Jarniecki's men had preloaded their weapons, rotated firing to maintain a sustained rate of fire, and used the noise and shock of gunfire to break up Tatar charges at the critical moment when the formation's horses were most vulnerable. Right before impact. The Tatars, for all their skill and numbers, had a problem they couldn't solve. Their greatest weapon, numbers, became partly neutralized by the circular formation. You can't flank a circle. You can't get behind a circle. And every time you try to flood a section of the circle with enough men to simply overwhelm it by weight of numbers, the tight quarters actually work against you. Your own mass gets in the way of your attack. Men crowding each other, horses bumping and interfering. The back ranks unable to bring their weapons to bear. 6 hours. 6 hours this went on. Wave after wave after wave. The Tatars were not giving up. They had too much military pride, too much invested in this raid, too much sheer numerical confidence to believe that 400 men could hold them. They kept coming. They shifted tactics. Arrows from distance, then charges close in, then arrows again, trying to exhaust the defenders, trying to wear down their will. Wounded men fought on. Dead horses were used as cover. The circle grew smaller as casualties mounted, but it did not break. Here is where the story takes a turn that reveals something profound about the nature of courage and its effect on the enemy. The Tatars had fought many battles in their centuries of raiding. They had faced resistance before. Desperate garrisons, suicidal last stands, men who fought because they had nowhere to run. They had broken all of them. Numbers break courage eventually. Physics breaks courage. The mathematics of attrition break courage, or so they believed. But what was happening inside the Tatar command as those 6 hours dragged on was something that hadn't happened in a very long time. Doubt. Because they weren't breaking these 400 men. Wave after wave of their finest cavalry, warriors who had ridden south with the absolute certainty that nothing in Podolia could stop them, were crashing against that circle and bouncing back with casualties. Not devastating casualties. The Poles couldn't kill 40,000 people with 400, but steady, consistent, demoralizing casualties. And this mattered because of what the Tatar military culture valued above almost everything else: efficiency. Raiding is a commercial enterprise as much as a military one. You ride into enemy territory. You take what you can carry. You get home before the defender can organize a counterattack. Speed and low casualties are the whole point. You don't spend 6 hours bashing your men against a defensive circle when there's an entire province full of undefended villages and unprotected civilians just waiting to be looted. Every hour those 40,000 Tatar horsemen spent battering against that circle at Hodów was an hour they weren't raiding villages. An hour they weren't collecting the human cargo that was the entire economic purpose of the campaign. An hour during which Polish commanders elsewhere might be receiving word of the invasion and riding hard to cut off the retreat route. The calculus of the raid was shifting, and the Tatar commanders knew it. Think about that from their perspective. You came with 40,000 warriors to sweep through an undefended frontier. Instead, you've spent 6 hours being repeatedly stabbed in the face by 400 men who apparently don't know they're supposed to die. Your men are tired. Your horses are tired. You're burning daylight and raiding season simultaneously. And those 400 lunatics in their circle show absolutely no sign of being willing to stop. There's a concept in military psychology about the moral force of an enemy that simply refuses to be beaten. It's one thing to face an enemy who fights bravely and eventually breaks. That's the expected narrative, the comforting story, where numbers and logic win in the end. It's something else entirely to face an enemy who should have broken 100 times over and hasn't. That second kind of enemy does something to the human mind. It plants a seed of doubt that is completely disproportionate to the actual tactical situation. What are these men? What are they? That is the question that was growing in the minds of the Tatar commanders as the afternoon wore on at Hodów. And then they did something extraordinary. Something that reveals just how deeply those 400 Poles had gotten inside their heads. They sent a translator under a flag of truce. Stop and appreciate what just happened. 40,000 warriors sent a man under a white flag to negotiate with 400. The Tatar translator rode toward the Polish circle. He carried an offer that was, by every objective measure, extremely generous. Safe conduct, free passage, your lives. Just put down your weapons and ride away. We'll let you go. We'll call this a draw, even though everyone here knows it isn't. Because what just happened over these 6 hours wasn't a draw. It was something that has no name in the language of war. The translator delivered the message. He spoke to Czarniecki. And Czarniecki laughed. He didn't rage. He didn't make a defiant speech. He didn't invoke Poland or God or the memory of the deluge. He laughed, the way a man laughs when the absurdity of the universe delivers itself to him in crystalline form. And then he said no. The translator rode back, and then, the Tatars did something that even historians who have studied this battle for their entire careers still find almost incredible. They left. 40,000 warriors. They gathered up their dead and their wounded. They consolidated their formation, and they withdrew from the field. They turned their horses east, and they rode back toward Crimea. They did not resume the attack. They did not wait for Czarniecki's men to run out of ammunition, out of horses, out of blood. They didn't do what every tactical principle said they should do, which was to simply keep coming until the numbers made the result inevitable. They left. Because something had broken, not in the Polish formation, but in the Tatar mind. The moral victory that Czarniecki's 400 had achieved over those 6 hours was so complete, so overwhelming, so psychologically devastating, that continuing the battle had become unthinkable. Not impossible, not suicidal, just unthinkable. Because to continue attacking would be to admit that you needed 40,000 men to kill 400. And that was a story the Crimean Khanate could not afford to tell about itself. The dust cloud moved east. The war cries faded. The ground, which had been churned into a churning mess of hoofprints and blood, and spent casings, and broken weapons, went quiet. 400 men sat in their circle and watched 40,000 enemies ride away. Some of them probably couldn't speak. Some of them probably couldn't stop shaking. That post-combat tremor that hits when the adrenaline leaves your body and your nervous system tries to process what just happened. Some of them wept, some of them prayed, and some of them, if the stories are to be believed, laughed. The Polish losses at Hodów are estimated at somewhere between several dozen to around 100 men, along with significant numbers of horses. Wounded men certainly outnumbered the dead. It was a heavy price for 400. It was an extraordinarily light price for what they had achieved. Tatar losses are harder to calculate precisely, as they always are with steppe cavalry, who carried their dead with them. But contemporary accounts and later historical analysis suggest several hundred Tatar warriors killed over the course of the 6-hour battle, which, against 40,000, sounds insignificant until you remember that those several hundred men were killed by 400 enemies who were simultaneously being attacked from every direction, simultaneously maintaining a defensive formation, simultaneously managing wounded horses and wounded comrades, and diminishing ammunition supplies. 400 men, 6 hours, 40,000 enemies turned back. It will never be one of the most extraordinary small-unit military engagements in human history. Now, let's talk about what this meant. Not just in the moment, not just for those 400 men and their families and the villages they saved. Let's talk about the long ripple of consequence that spread outward from that circle in the Podolian dust on the 29th of September, 1694. The immediate military consequence was real, if limited. The Tatar raid was turned back. The villages that had been in the path of those 40,000 horsemen were not burned. The people who would have been taken into slavery were not taken. Somewhere between several thousand and tens of thousands of lives. We cannot know the exact number, but the scale of a 40,000-man raid gives us the framework. We're preserved by the refusal of 400 men to move. Think about those people. They never knew how close it came. They woke up on the 30th of September in their homes. They tended their animals. They worried about their harvests and their debts and their relationships and all the ordinary anxious texture of human life. And they had no idea that the day before, 400 men had stood between them and a catastrophe that would have ended their world. History is full of that kind of invisible salvation, full of moments where someone's terrible, impossible day meant that someone else got to have an ordinary one. But the consequences ran deeper than one saved raid. The Battle of Hodów became, almost immediately, something more than a military engagement. It became a story. It became the kind of story that gets told and retold in barracks, around campfires, in the great halls of Polish noble houses. The kind of story that shapes how a military culture understands itself and what it believes itself capable of. For the Polish Hussars, already the most celebrated cavalry force in Europe following the Battle of Vienna 11 years earlier, Hodów was another chapter in a mythology that was beginning to feel less like mythology and more like a documented, repeatable historical fact. These men were simply not ordinary. The numbers confirmed it. The outcomes confirmed it. Over and over again, in engagement after engagement across the 17th century, Polish cavalry had beaten odds that should have been impossible. At Kruszyn in 1610, 6,000 Poles, including 5,000 Hussars, are defeating 35,000 combined Russian and Swedish troops. At Berestechko in 1651, Hussar charges routing an enormous Cossack Tatar army. At Vienna in 1683, 3,000 Winged Hussars leading the largest cavalry charge in European history and breaking an Ottoman army that had successfully besieged the Habsburg capital for 2 months. And now, at Hodów, 400 men holding off 40,000 for 6 hours and refusing a ceasefire offer. What do you do with that pattern? What does it tell you about what's possible? It tells you something that military theorists have wrestled with for centuries. That in warfare, the moral and the numerical are not simply additive factors that you can balance against each other like weights on a scale. They interact in ways that can produce outcomes that pure mathematics cannot predict. 400 men with absolute certainty in their own excellence, absolute commitment to their purpose, and absolute refusal to accept defeat can do things that 400 ordinary soldiers could never do. Not because the laws of physics suspended themselves over the Podolian steppe, but because the Tatar commanders were human beings, not machines. And human beings respond to the experience of moral shock in ways that machines would not. The Crimean Khanate never fully recovered the psychological dominance over the Polish frontier that they had maintained for 3 centuries. This is a complex historical claim, and I want to be careful not to overstate it. The Tatars continued to raid, continued to cause tremendous suffering across the next decades. History doesn't pivot on a single battle as cleanly as legend suggests it does. But Hodów was part of a broader pattern. The late 17th century was a period when the Crimean Khanate's ability to project power deep into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was gradually contracting. The battles of the Holy League's war against the Ottomans, including Polish campaigns in Ukraine and Moldova, were slowly grinding down Tatar military capacity. Hodów was not the cause of that contraction, but it was a crystalline expression of why the Tatar model of overwhelming numbers and shock and speed was becoming less reliable against the specific quality of Polish military resistance. The broader historical context matters here too. In 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz ended the Great War of the Holy League against the Ottomans. The Ottomans ceded Hungary, Transylvania, and Podolia to the Habsburgs and Poland, respectively. The frontier that the 400 men at Hodów had fought to defend was within 5 years of their stand, officially recognized as Polish territory, at least for a time. The sacrifice and the courage had not been in vain, even if the men who made that stand could not have known in 1694 what the next 5 years would bring. And then there is the tragedy embedded in this story, because Polish history rarely escapes tragedy for long. John III, Sobieski, the great king, the hero of Vienna, the man who had built the military culture that produced the warriors of Hodów, died in June of 1696. Less than 2 years after Hodów, the Commonwealth he left behind was already fracturing under the pressures that had always threatened it. Foreign interference in royal elections, factional warfare among the nobility, the structural paralysis of the liberum veto, the systematic undermining of central authority by a political class that valued its own privileges above the survival of the state. Within a generation, the Commonwealth would descend into a series of crises from which it would never recover. By 1772, the first partition of Poland carved off enormous territories to Russia, Prussia, and Austria. By 1795, Poland had ceased to exist as an independent state entirely. The nation that produced the warriors of Hodów, the Winged Hussars of Vienna, the most extraordinary cavalry tradition in the history of Europe, that nation was erased from the map of the world. It would not return for 123 years. There is something almost unbearable about that historical arc. The nation that saved Western civilization at Vienna in 1683, and that produced 400 men who stopped 40,000 at Hodów in 1694, that contributed more to the survival of Christian Europe than any comparable state. That nation was slowly dismembered by the very powers it had helped to save. Austria, which Sobieski had rescued from the Ottomans, participated in the partition. Russia, whose own frontier was protected by Polish resistance to Tatar raids for generations, helped erase Poland from the map. History is not just. It does not reward courage with survival. It does not guarantee that extraordinary people will live to see the world they fought for. But here is what history cannot erase: the record. The documented, verified, historically confirmed record of what 400 human beings did on the 29th of September, 1694, in a field outside a village called Hodów, in a region called Podolia, in a country that does not currently exist on the map of the world. They formed their circle, They held. They refused the offer of survival. They broke 40,000 enemies without being broken themselves. And that is forever. I want to leave you with something that has stayed with me since I first read about Hodów. Something that I think reaches beyond military history, beyond Poland, beyond the 17th century, and touches something that is permanently, stubbornly, irreducibly human. When the Tatar translator rode toward that circle under his flag of truce, he was not just carrying an offer of safe conduct, he was carrying the world's verdict, the world's calculation, when he was the physical embodiment of the mathematical truth that 40,000 is 100 times 400, and 100 times is too many. And the world has an established process for situations like this. And the process is, you surrender, you live, and the numbers win. And Czarniecki laughed at the verdict. Not because he was stupid, not because he didn't understand the math. He understood it perfectly. He laughed because he understood something else too, that the verdict of mathematics and the verdict of will are not always the same verdict. That there are moments in human history when a small number of people who refuse to accept what the numbers say can force the universe to revise its answer. Leadership is not the ability to project invincibility. It's the ability to look at a situation that demands despair and choose, so deliberately, consciously, with full knowledge of the risks, to demand something different. Czarniecki didn't save those 400 men from fear. They were afraid. Fear on a battlefield is not something you eliminate. It is something you choose to act through. He gave them a framework for their fear that made action possible. We are the best in the world at this. We know how to fight these people, and the only thing they can take from us is our lives. Not our pride, not our honor, not our refusal. That is the gift that extraordinary military leadership gives to the people under its command. Not safety, not victory guaranteed, just the conviction that the attempt is worth everything. Think about that the next time you face something that seems numerically impossible. The odds against you do not automatically determine the outcome. The Tatars at Hodów had the math on their side. They did not win. I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what you think about Hodów. Does this story surprise you? Do you think you would have held your position? Are there other forgotten battles from Polish history, or from the history of any nation, that you think deserve this kind of treatment? I read every comment, every single one. This channel grows because of the conversations we have in that comment section, and I am genuinely grateful for every person who takes the time. If you made it this far, and the fact that you did tells me something about the kind of viewer you are, please consider subscribing. Not as a favor to me, because there are more stories like this one waiting. The history of humanity is full of moments where the numbers were wrong, and the math got laughed at by 400 people on horseback. I intend to tell every single one of them. 400 men, 40,000 enemies, 6 hours, 1 laugh, and then the dust cloud moved east, and those 400 men rode home.